Morse here, Left Right Radio, every afternoon at noon sharp, Monday through Friday. My guest is Erica Scharrer. Dr. Scharrer is a professor of communication at Mass-Amherst, family research scholar. She's done a lot of field work in the area of, analyzing media and its effect on young people, with an emphasis on field work, visiting classrooms and teenagers to gather data. Erica, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Happy to be here.
Erica, I'm interested in the influence of media today on young people with regard to the increase in violence. We know the extreme examples of violence, certainly, which is mass murders in high schools. Which is a phenomenon that really seemed to have gotten off the ground in almost an epidemic way with the Columbine killings, which was, I think, about 18 years ago now. And when these things happen, you wonder what is going on with young people, particularly males, that is leading to this kind of violence when it really wasn't the case before. You've been out in the field, and I know this is obviously an extremely complex and nuanced subject, but could you share some of your observations on that?
Absolutely. It's such an important question. And we are experiencing an epidemic of violence, and we need to find out what's going on. It is a complicated question, as you mentioned, but I think we can point to a few observations that scholars have determined in the research on media and violence and aggression, especially in terms of youth. So one thing that scholars like to do is differentiate between violent acts and aggressive acts, even though those two things overlap. Violent acts are usually the more extreme ones, the things that you mentioned that will end up in newspaper headlines and in tragic outcomes. And when that is the case, the contribution of media to someone's decision that is so extreme and severe and goes so decidedly against social norms, the contribution of media violence to that tends to be rather small. It's typically overshadowed by other factors in a person's life. Whereas if you think about the day-to-day forms of aggression, and here aggression is kind of a more general umbrella term, verbal forms of aggression, lower levels of harm if it does indeed get physical. For those sorts of behaviors, the contribution of the media influence tends to be a little bit higher. So typically the pattern is the more severe the influence, or the more severe the outcome rather of the violent behavior, the smaller the media contribution. But having said that, that doesn't mean the media contribution is zero. There is absolutely a possibility that drawing from messages from media is at least partly, in some small way, operating in concert with other things to help facilitate, the sorts of, unfortunately, tragic and horrific instances that we do seem to see more and more.
Now, in the area of media, I would include in that, for example, some of the gaming things. I remember reading that in the case of Columbine, these kids were very involved with games, very violent games. And when I say involved, I'm talking, 5-6 hours a day, which it can be very desensitizing when you're killing people online and shooting people, and how many can you shoot to win the game and that sort of thing. They almost had the sensation, my understanding, when they went out and started shooting their classmates, it's almost as if they were in a game. It was like an unreality experience for them. Now, my understanding is that since then, there's been a toning down of the use of these games. I mean, it's been less violent. The other thing that's changed is that they were on prescription drugs that were for psychological problems. That has reduced since then. I think there's been the psychological community has learned that this was a little too quick to subscribe these things to people, because if you read the fine print on these jars, it says homicide, suicide. I mean, if you don't take it right, or you maybe should look at alternatives. But you're talking not so much about big media and its violent influence, as what you call aggressions. Can you give me some examples of what that means? I mean, what do you mean by aggressions?
Yeah, great question. And one of the challenges of research in this area is to try to study something that's really hard to measure and that, our ethics as researchers make particularly difficult. So if we want to know, does media violence actually make people aggressive? There's only so much we can do as ethical social scientists to try to kind of, approximate the sort of aggression that people might actually engage with in their lives. So this has led to some kind of, backdoor, sideways ways of measuring aggression, some of which are maybe more convincing than others. Right. So when social scientists measure aggression, they might ask people to self-report. So we might say to a young person, fill out this questionnaire and let me know over the past 12 months, have you ever been involved in, say, a fist fight in the hallway at school? Mm-hmm. Or have you ever been involved in, shoving somebody in anger? So those are the sorts of self-report of aggression that researchers can sometimes rely upon. Of course, self-report, sometimes people don't want to confess, right, to some of these behaviors. So we also try to come up with other ways of measuring aggression. So one way we might do that is give people like a vignette or a scenario and say, if this happened to you, what might you do? When we're talking about really young kids, researchers sometimes just observe them on the playground, observe them playing with toys, interacting with others, and, literally kind of count the instances in which they're either cooperating or in conflict with others around them. And then sometimes there are other ways of measuring aggression in the lab, like by, doing something unpleasant to somebody. It's not necessarily hurting them physically, but it's meant to be unpleasant. So across all of those different ways of studying aggression, most of the research has found that media violence does make that more likely, those sorts of engagements more likely than, not being, impacted by media violence, not being exposed by media violence, or perhaps having less violent images in your life. And just to go back to the issue of, Columbine and these tragic that we can't really know what caused those things as researchers because they're already done. Researchers tend to kind of try to control variables and observe them one at a time. And once something, as tragic as a school shooting has happened, we're in the realm of speculation. We can use research to try to form that speculation. I caution any researcher against kind of, pointing conclusively about what caused somebody to, enact a mass shooting of any kind when that has not been subject to the sorts of social science, techniques on which we rely.
I understand. I mean, basically the issue of, I'm getting a little echo here. Of the roughhousing or physical assault, I would think that with younger people that would be a normal thing. I mean, it's kind of like young boys sort of discovering their boundaries a bit and maybe dealing with solving problems. I mean, it's kind of a natural thing. I don't think it's necessarily a bad form of aggression unless you have a case where there's bullying, and I suppose we ought to look at the difference between normal roughhousing in a schoolyard and outright bullying where people are ganging up on one student. So I guess that, and you say that results in, that is more correlated to media violence. The other question, I want to know exactly, I'd like you to define a little bit more, maybe not so much with younger people, but maybe with teenagers, what you mean by aggression and aggressive behavior, and also with regard to the Columbines and whatnot. I really have to take issue with you on that. I think that it can be analyzed in the aftermath. It ought to be. It should be treated scientifically, no different than if there's a plane crash. The FAA goes in with investigators and they take a look at what happened to this plane. Was it a design flaw? Was it age? Was it wear and tear? Was it human error? And they try to make recommendations. They make a report that maybe can solve some problems going forward in the future so that there's less plane crashes. I would think that the issue of school shooters, it can be looked at across the board and examined to find out if there are any similarities in the psychological makeup and in the environment and the circumstances of each of these cases, so that they can identify things that could then be looked upon and solved, and that it's absolutely critical that we do that. But I want to talk about, again, the business of aggressions. What specifically, I mean, you're saying like a shove in the hallway. Are these situations that have increased over time? I mean, is there any data on that? And if so, why?
That's a good question. And honestly, I'm not sure if those instances have increased over time. So I have to get back to you on that question. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is a distinction between, the sort of act that that happened at Columbine or in Parkland, Florida, and the more common day-to-day interactions that we have mm-hmm. with people around us. And I actually think the influence of the media is more important in those day-to-day interactions because it's so profound, and right. It's so widespread. So, I think that the Columbines and the Parklands are horrific and they capture our attention and our hearts and minds as well they should, but they are also still, even though they're a little bit more common these days than they used to, they're aberrations, right? They're not, everyday life.
Understood.
And so, I think my own research and a lot of the social scientists who study this is a little bit more keyed into daily interactions, the sort of thing that can be a little bit more typical.
Right, and yeah, I think
that a post tragedy analysis is incredibly important for sure. But right. Of course, the human brain and what makes it tick is although airplane engines are super complicated too, the human mm-hmm. brain and what makes it tick is a little bit less, I think, open to kind of a post tragedy inspection.
Right. But I think that our social scientists could at least begin to take a look at whether there are similarities, because there has been an increase in that. Now, Can you give me examples of situations in the media, whether it be television, radio, print, whatever, the mass media, that young people are exposed to that is contributing to this increase in aggressions?
Yes. So I think mostly what we're interested in examining and being critical of and maybe putting pressure on the media industries to reduce is the sort of depiction of violence where it seems to occur without any consequences, where it's glamorized, where it's glorified, where the people who are the perpetrators either get away with it or, the ramifications for them and the people around them are somehow outside of the narrative. We also want to be really wary of violence where it seems like the person who was doing it had a good reason to do it. So researchers call this justified violence. And the problem with depicting this in the media is that people in their daily lives might feel that they're justified to be aggressive or violent as well. So if they see movies, television shows, video games where, it's okay if the superhero is aggressive because he is fighting for right over wrong, then a person can really internalize, it's okay for me to be aggressive when I'm wronged, right? Or if I'm doing something that I believe in. And so there's a bit of a, slippery slope. Not all violent depictions are equally likely to lead to a negative effect. The ones that are the ones where violence is rewarded, it's justified, it's done by the characters who we look up to. So actually the good guys performing violence in media scripts, superheroes are a great example, is more problematic to the audience than the bad guys performing violence in media scripts, because we're more likely to emulate them, admire them, look up to them, and learn from them. The combination of violence with humor can desensitize people. And that's something that you mentioned that I'd love to come back to in our conversation. Underlying a lot of what we're talking about is a callousness that I think we should all be concerned about as a society. And, I feel quite strongly that media have an influence on that, right? If you're entertained by hours and hours of watching people hurt each other, maybe even playing the part of the perpetrator through interactive media technologies like video games. What does that tell you about human suffering, right? And how does that change your threshold for what you expect to see, what you think is just normal and there's nothing we can do about it, maybe even what you're likely to intervene in? So the idea of desensitization is a really powerful media effect that I think we really need to be critical of.
No, I mean, look, I agree with you in my own kind of unscientific observation that violence has become almost commodified. It's become removed from reality and what it actually is and what it does. I think that superhero movies are good examples. I've seen a few of them with my own daughter and, the Marvel comics. I remember as a kid watching these things, and there was some violence, but it was not, it was usually very proscribed and very specific. Whereas now it's 2 hours of violence. I mean, they're just kicking the what out of each other. Yeah. And, it's glamorized. It looks so, and nobody gets hurt is the irony. You can shoot, you have the superhero walking through a field with bullets flying everywhere and they're like, fine. I mean, it's not real. It's almost like, use of violence for entertainment purposes. It becomes an unreal thing. I mean, I think that possibly is part goes to what I was talking about with the violent video games and the Columbine guys. They were like, it was not even real. They felt like they were going in and shooting people. It was almost like they were in a game. Their consciousness, young people, especially maybe under the age of 20, they're not yet emotionally, let alone physically developed enough to know how to process and integrate these things. It's one thing for an adult, but they become, it's just for the same reason that they're not old enough to drink, because their bodies are not yet developed enough to handle that substance, and they can end up in a lot more trouble than a mature adult. So, I mean, I think that your points in that way are very well taken.
And one thing that I think we all have to kind of square and wrap our heads around is how can, these phenomena that we're talking about be happening at the same time that until very recently, violent crime is actually down in U.S. society, right? So the last 2 years, we've seen a little uptick in violent crime. But before that, we've been on about a 50-year decline in violent crime. So some people who kind of critique the media's role or potential role in all of this say, if games are really making people violent, why is it that as games have gotten more and more popular, breaking sales records, and absolutely have contained quite a bit of violence, the most popular games are usually the most violent games, shooter games, and games in franchises like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. So how can all this circulation of violent games be happening at the same time that violent behavior is down? So that's why I kind of circle back to my first observation that for most people, most of the time, the effect of games on aggression is going to be, thankfully, we live in this world, relatively low levels of harm, right? But every once in a while, in some cases where there are other psychosocial factors going on in people's lives, maybe media contribute to kind of, a toxic blend of other influences, and the outcome becomes more severe. So I do think that it's not necessarily inherent contradiction when you kind of go back to the idea of extremely violent events, thankfully still being somewhat of an aberration in society. But the day-to-day lives of people, I think, really being influenced by things like desensitization, by things like, lower levels, but still unpleasant levels of aggression, including things like name calling, leaving people out. You asked earlier about what else is aggression. And just kind of accepting violence, right, for being part of our world. And the other part I would love to just add to the conversation is the idea of gender. So that's, I think, another really important question. of the perpetrators of these mass shootings identify, as male. How are the messages that we're sending through media and other forms of culture being kind of received differentially based on someone's own gender identity? And, might media be one way that we're teaching boys and men how to be boys and men? And if we are, I've got new data on this that I'm really excited to share with the world. And my new data do find that exposure to certain types of television, including sports programming and police and detective shows, and to a lesser extent, reality television, video games, all of those things seem to play a role in what young people think of when they think of masculinity. And the more they're exposed to those media forms, the more they think of masculinity as being inherently something that celebrates aggression, something that celebrates dominance, something that celebrates even what researchers call restrictive emotionality, meaning, you're not allowed to show your emotions unless it's anger. Right. And so, there's also these new data that suggest, media could be not only perhaps contributing to our aggression and in some severe cases, violence, but also helping us learn, how to be as kind of, gendered human beings and sending a particular message to men and boys in the audience.
Well, I do think that men and boys in particular are told or taught not to show too much emotion because that's seen as feminine, and I think that's wrong. And it's not, it's kind of an ingrained thing. The business of violence in movies, I think the classic example was maybe a strong male who is, committing a very specific act of violence to stop evil. Yes. I think of like High Noon at the OK Corral, or some of the old Gary Cooper movies, or some of the Western movies, where they would go in and they would stop some evildoers from doing what they're doing. And it was not focused on the violence, although that was there. It was focused on the moral story and the moral play. Whereas now the violence is the bigger focus. It's like it becomes a means to an end. And the moral aspect of it is almost secondary. And so you just, it's almost like the moral aspect is just used as a platform and an excuse to let people go shoot each other up, and that very well might be what's having this bad influence, especially on males.
Yeah. And I think part of it explain that change, the change in technology. So technological special effects have gotten more advanced from in every media type. And so being able to depict those violent, images has really changed. They've become so much more realistic looking. They've become so much more of a spectacle, and I think there are huge budgets with television, movies, and games to produce images that look real and are, like you say, kind of over the top in their vividness, and a huge departure from what we used to see. There are also new data just out that show that the amount of violent acts on television in prime time has increased. For sure. So not only do we have more violent images on television, for instance, than we used to have, but also what we see is so much more real, and very little is left to the imagination, right? I watched one. For one of my research projects, I watched television shows that were created in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it was fascinating to watch how the depiction of violence has changed across the decades. And one way is, what I call vividness. What is shown, what is not shown, but maybe implied. And that's a huge part of how violence has changed. It's gotten more graphic. Right. The actual consequences are shown, whereas it used to be kind of implied off screen. You'd see someone who had met an unfortunate demise, but now you see them meeting that unfortunate demise. Right. So so much more, imagery about actual harm that I think we're only beginning to kind of, skim the surface about the implications of that for the people who are raised in this society where that becomes their norm in their
I totally concur in just a casual observation. If you see an episode of Columbo, for example, you wouldn't see any violence. You might see them lift up a little tarp and look inside and then put it down. You don't see it. Whereas now, if they did that, you'd see all the gore. You'd see everything. And,
Exactly.
that's very desensitizing. It also takes away from the actual character development and what's going on, and the use of your intellect and your emotion to help solve the problem and think through who did it and how are they going to solve it. It all becomes the sensational. It goes to, in a way, it's almost a return to the Roman gladiators. People would go to watch people get torn from limb to limb by lions. I mean, and they would be there waving and cheering and celebrating it. It's almost it's outright glorification of violence for violence sake. I mean, it does seem like we're moving in that direction. Now, Erica, you're involved in, as you mentioned, field work, and you're in an institute right now that's making recommendations. What are you prescribing? I mean, what do you see? What can we do? What can we tell our media people, our media movers and shakers? How can they do this and yet still be profitable and have viable entities without this?
Such a good question. And, when you talked about gladiators, I think if we had people who create movies and games and television in front of us, they might say, all we're doing is giving people what they want, right? That there's an appetite for this. That's why it's there. But I would push that a little bit. I would push back on that a little bit, because I'm not sure that that's, what everybody wants. If you look at the most popular, not everybody, right? And,
we all want all sorts of things that aren't good for us. I mean, sure. I mean,
exactly. There have actually been a couple studies that have tried to answer the question of, can things be equally exciting and appealing, especially to kids, if the violence is somehow removed, but the action and the kind of whodunit aspect remains? And the answer there have only been a few studies about this, so we can't, reach too much of a strong conclusion. But each one of those studies suggests that, maybe it's not the violence that we actually audiences like, it's that being drawn into action and adventure. And, if I had an audience with the creators of these stories, I would say, challenge yourself to tell these stories and have plot intrigue and have action and adventure without necessarily showing the vividness of the violence.
You don't have to actually see the violence.
Why do we?
We also don't have to see the sex either. I mean, that can be implied as well. It doesn't have to, they make jokes about that. Every movie has to have some nudity. It's like, not really. You can have something be sexy without having, we don't have to see them doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And you can even tell, stories of violence, you can tell in a way that's responsible too, right? So I would also go back to the question of, if you're doing, say, a World War II film, there is going to be violence, right? Understood. Nobody's questioning that. How is it shown, right? For what purpose is it shown?
It's more powerful if they don't show it. I mean, I think a good example of that is Schindler's List. It did show just moments of violence only to illustrate the story, but it wasn't egregious. It got into the characters, it got into their experience of what was actually going on, and it was much more effective in a way. You got a much better sense of the evil and the violence itself without having to go through seeing it. To see it almost reduces it in its magnitude.
Yeah, and I think, war films sometimes as a whole genre do a more reasonable job than some of Hollywood's other entertainment fare at showing consequences, is showing the consequences of war. And for people who haven't, served in an armed conflict, that's our only window, right? It's our primary window into what it's like. So showing the consequences on bodies, on the psychology of the people involved, that's actually what I would call a responsible way of showing violence. So if violence is to appear, making sure it's not gratuitous, making sure the actual consequences for both perpetrator and victim are, approximated as closely as possible to what it would be like in real life. I think those are really ethical decisions. But my other answer to your question about what can we do also lies in, the role of us as audience members and maybe parents and caregivers who are trying to raise kids in this environment, and I think there are many, many principles of media literacy that apply apply to any kind of media message, including, asking questions about what you see and asking, does it have to be like this? What are the values that are present in what I'm seeing right now? What's absent from what I'm seeing right now? Who created this and why did they make it this way? If we ask those active questions about media in our lives, then I think it puts us in the realm of being kind of really smart, inquiring media audiences, right? Who are kind of, not just assuming this is just entertainment, so it doesn't matter what it's like. Even entertainment matters, right? The stories that we tell in our culture matter.
That's right. And I think it's examples of We Don't Need the Violence, of the continued success of Disney movies and of Christian media. They have some tremendously successful movies. All right, Erica, I want you to, because we're reaching the end of the program, could you, if you like, give out information in terms of where people can read up on your work and reach you? Do you want to give out a website?
I can be reached on the UMass website through the Department of Communication at UMass. My studies appear in some of the academic journals. So if you kind of go on Google Scholar and type in my name, which is hard to spell, but if you just spell it correctly, you can find some of these studies that I'm referencing, and of course other people's scholarship as well, to hopefully bring some data to bear on these really important questions for society.
Well, you're doing important work, and it's work that is worthy of bringing up to as wide an audience as possible, because it's what we really need to be thinking about. And I really want to thank you for joining me this afternoon, Erica.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. All right, and I shall return tomorrow at the usual time, 12 noon. Have a good day.